What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about The Legend of Zelda. Recently, I guess starting yesterday, they had some sort of conference or something over in Japan. It might have been like some sort of pre-Tokyo Game Show conference or something. Nintendo did something, and they released a bunch of new information about the upcoming title in the series, Skyward Sword. And some of the stuff that they're talking about these days is pretty interesting. So I want to talk about Skyward Sword, but I don't think I really have enough material to really dedicate a whole episode of this to Skyward Sword. So I figured instead what I would do is kind of talk about the Zelda series up until this point, and then talk about Skyward Sword. So what I'm going to do is kind of talk about each game a little bit in turn, starting from the very beginning. So the original Legend of Zelda, the very first game, released in 1986 on the original Nintendo. This thing came out before I was even born. The series is just slightly older than I am. So obviously, it's not that surprising that the original Zelda isn't a game that I personally grew up with, like a lot of other people did. So that's not something I can claim, unfortunately, but I have played through it, and I don't know, there's not a whole lot to say about it, really, just because it's a Nintendo game, so by definition, it's a fairly simplistic game. But with that said, all things considered, for a Nintendo game, the original Zelda was amazing. It is, a huge breakthrough in any number of ways. It was a little bit light on story. I'm pretty sure almost the entire extent of the story was made up in like little scrolling menus before and maybe after you beat the game, and I'm sure there's probably some stuff in the instruction manual, but gameplay-wise, the game was huge. There's tons of secrets all over the place. The dungeons were huge. Obviously the gameplay, there were elements of it that were, kind of flawed, like just the fact that you had to literally look everywhere and do everything possible to just to find everything. But you have to give it a little bit of flack. It was the original Zelda game. It was on a Nintendo. And not only was the game huge, but there was the second quest too. After you beat the game, there's a whole second quest to play through. And that was just, astounding. So, it obviously suffers a bit from being a Nintendo game. It's it's 25 years old this year. It's the 25th anniversary this year. So, obviously a 25-year-old game is going to suffer a little bit. But all things considered, there's a reason this series became so big. And the original Zelda is a big part of it. So second up is The Adventure of Link, which is, of course, the sequel, the second game on the original Nintendo, and it came very soon after the first game, and like a lot of sequels that people end up rushing out to try and capitalize on the success of the previous game, Adventure of Link, not as good. Now, how bad it is, people's opinions tend to vary a lot on this matter. Personally, I think that it deserves some credit at least, because it's pretty obvious that it's not as good as other games in the series. It's a really big departure, and it's pretty notorious for being brutally difficult and all that other stuff. It does lots of kind of silly things, but in the end of the day, honestly, I don't think it's all that bad. Story-wise, it's actually, probably better than the first game, because you have stuff like exploring towns, and you upgrade your well, I guess you don't really upgrade your weapons, but you upgrade your sword at least, and I don't know, there's some nice little elements to it. It would be nice if it was a little bit less difficult, or at least, more forgiving. But I mean, I don't think it deserves quite as much hate as it tends to get. I honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people hate on it just because they don't know how to kill Dark Nuts. Which, I mean, I wouldn't blame them for that because it's certainly not an easy task, but I don't think it deserves as much hate as it gets. Although, I am willing to admit that, the only reason I ever actually beat that game was because I was doing it on an emulator and I abused save states just a little bit. But with that said, we're moving on to the next game. Link to the Past, the first game on the Super Nintendo, and huge step forward for the series. I mean, Link to the Past to this day stands in my mind as probably one of, if not the strongest game in the series. Like, there's pretty much nothing you can say to complain about Link to the Past. And I mean, even beyond, the normal stuff that you look at with a game, I have really fond memories of Link to the Past for a bunch of reasons. I mean, it was a really big game in my childhood. I played it a lot. I watched my dad play it when I was really young. But I mean, even more than that, Link to the Past is one of those games that it got me onto gaming. It's like, without Link to the Past, I would probably be a very different person today. I mean, Link to the Past, I don't know if it's the first, I don't think it's the first video game I ever played, so to speak. I probably played, Mario and Duck Hunt and stuff at like a friend's house or something. But it's definitely it's the first video game that I ever owned. I got it, I think, for my 6th birthday present, along with a Super Nintendo. And I don't know. I mean, even before that, my dad and I used to rent the game and the system on weekends quite a bit. But I mean, the game itself is it's one of those games that, even though it's kind of old, it feels really good even today. Like, the gameplay is just perfect. The puzzles are good. There's actually story there. There's tons and tons of exploration that's actually, somewhat intuitive, unlike the first Zelda game. And in that regard, it's actually a bit of a return to form from the first game. It kind of brought back the big, huge overworld and, exploration elements, and it really, took the graphics and the music to a whole new level. I mean, there's 2 worlds to explore. The kind of light world and dark world interaction brings a whole new kind of level to the game. And it's one of those just timeless games that, it's great. When did Link to the Past come out? 1991? So, I mean, it's great 20 years later. It'll probably still be great in 20 more years. I guess it doesn't even matter if Super Nintendos still work back then. Or back then? Still work in that time. But, anyways, I've raved about Link to the Past enough. So, next on the list is Link's Awakening. Now, Link's Awakening is a little bit of an odd game, because, of course, the original game came out after Link to the Past, but then they also re-released it maybe not several, but a few years later, after Ocarina of Time actually came out. They re-released it in color for the Game Boy Color. And Link's Awakening is a bit of an odd one for me. I played through pretty much the entire game, but at the same time, I really don't remember it all that well. What I remember is getting to one of the last dungeons. I can't remember if it was... I want to say it was the color dungeon that they added in for the DX version. But it might not have been one of those. I remember getting really stuck in a dungeon with a whole bunch of like toggle switches and stuff, and just not being able to do anything. And I basically just gave up after that. But Link's Awakening, I think, is a pretty interesting game just because it kind of proved that you can make a great game on, the Game Boy. I mean, it's obviously not the first or only good Game Boy game, but it's like they put all this on the Game Boy and it really didn't lose a whole lot. Just from going mobile, just from downgrading to, microscopic screen, and obviously the cartridges are microscopic. And yet, Link's Awakening, it really didn't lose a whole lot from that transition. With smart game design, and like the gameplay was still good. There's tons of exploration still. The story was a little bit of an acid trip, but when you really got into it, there are some really interesting elements to it. It was actually, a surprisingly dark story, despite, how much of the game is spent being, bright and colorful. And there's just a lot of interesting little things that you never would have really expected from a Game Boy game. And it's really kind of a surprising turn of events almost, because it's like, you really don't expect a Game Boy game to be that solid. And in a lot of ways, it's just as good as a lot of console games, except it's mobile. And it was really good at sucking up batteries. But anyways, after Link's Awakening, there was Ocarina of Time, which Ocarina of Time, almost speaks for itself, because it's kind of, I don't want to call it a cult following, but it's gained this reputation of being, the best game of all time. And it's actually kind of funny, because I remember back when it was first coming out, and I was super hyped about Ocarina of Time, and I didn't even have a Nintendo 64 yet. I wanted to buy a Nintendo 64 just to get Zelda 64, which, that was just what, everyone called it back then. Because every game was this and that 64 there. But, whatever. But I remember back then reading, magazine articles, and everyone was claiming, this is the best game ever made. And to this day, when Ocarina of Time was 98, so 13 years later, and a lot of people still believe Ocarina of Time is the best game ever made. Personally, I don't think that I agree. It's undeniable that Ocarina of Time is a great game. I actually have a bit of an odd relationship with Ocarina of Time. See, Ocarina of Time, I own more copies of this game than any other game. And that's not that to say I own like multiple copies of the game, but I own the original game on the Nintendo 64. I pre-ordered the Wind Waker, and I actually pre-ordered the Wind Waker before I even had a GameCube. But because I pre-ordered Wind Waker, I also got, what was it? Was that the Ocarina of Time and Master's Quest pre-order disc bonus thingy? It's basically, a GameCube disc that came with Ocarina of Time and the Master's Quest on it. And then also, later on, I managed to get my hands on a used copy of the Zelda collection for the GameCube as well, which also comes with Ocarina of Time. So I own 2 copies of Ocarina of Time on the GameCube and one for the original N64. For a while, I was considering buying a 3DS just to get, what's it called? Ocarina of Time 3D. But I was really hoping that they would put out some amazing Ocarina of Time bundles, but that never really ended up happening, so... Oh well, I'll probably end up picking it up eventually. But anyways, the whole point here is, I own a lot of copies of the game. I've probably played, a couple hundred hours of Ocarina of Time at least, all told. And yet, I've only ever actually beaten the game once. And even in that game, I haven't, gotten everything. Almost. I got all the items, I killed all the gold Skulltulas and all that stuff. But to this day, I'm stuck at 19 3/4 hearts. I just never could find that last piece of heart, and I even own the strategy guide, and even, going through that and checking every piece of heart in the game, I was never able to get that last piece of heart. But anyways, Ocarina of Time, needless to say, it's an amazing game, and it's kind of almost to the point where what really makes it great is almost, intangible. It's like, it's just straight up fun. I mean, it just did everything just so great. I mean, the gameplay is great, the story is great, the exploration is great, the music is great, the graphics were great for the time. They're not so great anymore, but I mean, honestly, I've never really cared a whole lot about graphics. I mean, the dungeons are great. There's just everything about it is great. I mean, I don't think it's as super fantastic, amazing as people tend to make it out to be. I think it kind of shares that stigma with Final Fantasy VII. People tend to think that, they're the best games ever made, just, without really being able to even quantify that or explain why. And they just say it because, everyone else says it or something. I don't know. Ocarina of Time is a great game. It's a great step forward for the series. Not the best game ever made. So after Ocarina of Time, there's of course Majora's Mask, which I was never really able to play on the N64 a whole lot. I rented it once, but they made the stupid decision to have the expansion pack or whatever that you needed for the N64 that you needed to play Majora's Mask, and that held me back. It probably held a lot of other people back as well. But I do, of course, own the Zelda Collector's Edition. Collector's Edition? The Zelda Collection. So that has Majora's Mask on it. So I played through most of the game on the GameCube. I got all the masks and, well, I don't know, not all the masks, but I did pretty much everything. I pretty much completed my Bomber's Notebook and all that stuff. But I've never beaten the game. I don't know why. It's just one of those things. It's like I got up to the whatever the fourth dungeon is, the Ikana Tower or whatever. I just never really felt like doing it. But I mean, Majora's Mask is one of those games where I think it tends to be really underappreciated because it did some really clever things. And I mean, talking about, exploration and stuff like that, I mean, that's one of the things they said they wanted to kind of improve with Skyward Sword, is that they didn't want to have just big open fields with nothing in them and stuff like that. But Majora's Mask did that stuff pretty much perfectly. I mean, just the pure density of stuff to do per square foot or whatever you want to call it of the game is just amazing. Like everywhere you go, there's stuff to do, even if you can't really tell that there's something there right off the bat. It's like there's all these people and they're all interesting, and there's the whole time aspect of you replay the same 3 days over and over again, which I think is an interesting aspect of the game. It's obviously there's some parts of it that are kind of annoying, but you get to see all these people go through their routines, and as you discover different aspects of the game and explore the town more, it's like you learn more and more about these people. Even if you were to play through the game again today, you might find something that you never found before. There's just so many little things packed into this game, and that's not even mentioning the dungeons and stuff. I mean, the dungeons I don't think were super awesome, amazing. I mean, they're pretty much on the same level as Ocarina of Time, which is saying a lot, honestly. But just the amount of stuff in this game to find and do and explore, and it's just so satisfying. And I almost think I'm one of those people that tend to almost think that it's better than Ocarina of Time, because I just eat that stuff up. I mean, they even give you the Bomber's Notebook, and I'm one of those people that's like, I have to check every single box in this notebook, and I'm not going to stop playing until I do. I really have to beat that game sometime. I mean, people tend to nitpick on it a lot because it's obviously, a really big departure from the rest of the series and even the genre as a whole. It does a lot of kind of obscure, unusual things. But, you shouldn't punish a game for trying to be unique and original. It's not like they did a bad job of it. I think it deserves, a lot of praise. But anyways, enough about that. Now, after Majora's Mask, they kind of went back to the whole handheld thing, which is kind of weird. It's something that they almost do every now and then. It's like, it's gonna be a while until we release the next big console Zelda game, so let's release 7 million handheld games to tide them over. That said, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, they're pretty good games. Personally, I've never played them a whole lot. I screwed around with Oracle of Ages once, and it was fun, but I just never really got into it. I mean, that's not to say, it was a bad game or I couldn't get into it because it wasn't entertaining or anything like that. I think my problem was I tend to be kind of paranoid about missing things, and so my thought process was, hey, if I use a walkthrough the entire time, I won't miss anything. And I kind of it was kind of a setup, because I ended up feeling like, okay, so I'm using a walkthrough, this walkthrough is doing all the work for me, so why am I even playing? I just stopped playing and I never went back. That said, I have watched full Let's Play walkthroughs of both games, as well as the password content and that stuff, which, I mean, obviously is very different from experiencing the game yourself. But, that said, the Oracle games are surprisingly good. And it goes back to what I was saying about Link's Awakening. It's like, they're very solid proof that you can take a mobile game and, just because it's mobile and has limited graphical qualities, and it's got limited storage space or whatever, and you can get a lot of mileage out of it. I mean, the Oracle games are still on the original Game Boy. I mean, by this point, it's the Game Boy Color. For a Game Boy game, these games are pretty freaking amazing. There's just so much just packed into these games. I mean, and not really in the same way as the Majora's Mask, but it's like the whole concept of switching the time around and switching the seasons. It just adds an extra layer of depth to it. And even on top of that, I mean, stuff like the dungeons, they have some really clever little puzzles. And one of the things that actually surprised me about the Oracle games is they have some really nifty items in them, and you just never see them again. And it's like, why? Why would you not use these items again? They're awesome. I don't know. I mean, I can't really say a whole lot to the Oracle games just because I haven't played them a whole lot myself. But I mean, they come across as games that, they're just another testament that mobile games can be amazing. Game Boy games can be amazing. The Oracle games are probably some of the best games on the Game Boy. So, after the Oracle games came the Wind Waker. And the Wind Waker is an odd game because it's very almost polarizing. A lot of people really don't like it. And honestly, I don't really know why, because I love the Wind Waker. And, to be honest, I'm probably a little bit biased, because Wind Waker is a very cartoony, cel-shaded game, and personally, I'm a huge fan of cel-shaded graphics. I can't even explain why. I just love shell shading. I just love cel shading. I think it looks so crisp and clean, and like I said, I'm trying to explain it now. But anyways, I mean, the Wind Waker, obviously it's not without its flaws. I mean, spending, 5,000 hours at a time sailing from one place to another isn't the best gameplay design ever. But I think Wind Waker, I mean, it did a lot of things right. I mean, it's a very solid game. Puzzles are good, the combat's fun, there's lots of new, sword techniques you can do. There's the exploration of, filling out your map, and there's tons of side quests, and the side quests are interesting. There's neat mini-games. A lot of the people that you meet are interesting. Very similar to Majora's Mask, A lot of the people that you actually meet in the game will end up being useful in one way or another, and that, if you solve their problems or whatever, they'll give you something. More so than the average Zelda game, I feel. And there's just, all the secret stuff to find, and I don't know, I mean, I just really enjoyed Wind Waker. The only problem I ever really had with it was the fact that I felt like it was a little bit too easy. I don't want to say that they went a little bit too kiddie with it, because I think that's just a stigma that the game tends to get because of its graphics, and I think that's a pretty naive thing to just assume. But I do think it was a little bit too easy for my tastes. But on the whole, I really enjoyed Wind Waker, and I probably played it all the way through more than any other Zelda game. Well, that's not true. I probably played Link to the Past more times through, but Wind Waker is a close second. I don't know. I mean, I don't get why people give it such a hard time, because I think it was a very, very solid game. After Wind Waker came Four Swords Adventure, which is a very odd game that a lot of people probably don't even realize exists. And Four Swords Adventure is kind of a departure. It's largely based on the success of when they re-released Link to the Past on the Game Boy. They included Four Swords mode to it, where it's basically like a co-op competitive multiplayer Zelda thing, where there's 4 different links, and they're all kind of, you have to work together to solve the puzzles and get through the dungeon, but at the same time, you're kind of competing to do the best. And Four Swords Adventure kind of takes that same concept and tries to build an entire game around it. And it was an interesting venture, because it's like they tried to do that whole thing and make it a whole game, but at the same time they also tried to make it a solid game that you can play single player. And they did that largely by giving you, when you're playing single player, the option to switch your 4 links into 4 different formations. There's like a line, a vertical line, a horizontal line, a square, and something else. It's not a great game. I mean, it's short. It's pretty simple. It's fairly restrictive. I mean, there's no exploration of any real description. You can only have 1 item at a time. As more or less just beat this level, beat this level, beat this level. So there's no like overworld or anything. There's no, there is a story. So I mean, it's pretty simplistic, but I thought it was a pretty fun game. I mean, it's probably not a game that I would ever play again, but I mean, I like the graphics. It's really colorful, and it's almost like a mix between Link to the Past and Wind Waker. And the concept of having the 4 links working together, I thought it was pretty fun. I mean, playing a single player is a little bit restrictive. It was probably a much better game played multiplayer, but even playing it single player, I mean, I enjoyed it, and I mean, I only rented the game, and I was able to play it all the way through. So I mean, it's pretty short in that regard. So I mean, it's not a game that's going to stand out as being one of the greats, but I thought it was worth the playthrough. I never felt like I was wasting my time playing it or anything. And now after Four Swords Adventure came the Minish Cap, which is yet another mobile game. I keep calling it the mobile, but it's a better term would probably be just handheld, because it's on a handheld game console. A Minish Cap was released for the Game Boy Advance. I guess it was the only Game Boy Advance Zelda game, with the exception of like re-releases and stuff. And Minish Cap struck me as a solid game. I mean, I'm sure it's getting kind of repetitive. I'm saying that about every Zelda game, but I mean, it's Zelda. Zelda is an amazing series. But in Minish Cap, it did a lot of interesting things. And for the most part, a lot of what they've done isn't stuff that we've seen in any other game. I mean, that kind of makes sense, because a lot of what defines Minish Cap is the Minish Cap and the Minish people. Minish being like little like miniature people that can only be seen by young people or something. But anyways, the whole point is you have this magic cap that talks to you like Navi, except it's nowhere near as annoying as Navi, and it's actually an interesting, funny little fellow. But anyways, this cap gives you the ability to like shrink down to mini size, and there's all this neat stuff you can do with that, When you shrink down, there's all these places you can go to explore and things you can do that you couldn't do when you were bigger. And that adds an interesting layer to the game, because it's almost, I mean, a lot of that, I'm sure you could do through different means. Like, you could shrink down low to fit through this crack and go around the corner and hit a switch or something. Or you could just as easily have made it in any other Zelda game. You could have easily have made it just like a wall that you bomb or something like that. But just kind of the feel of like using this power to like explore the world almost in more depth. And even just the aesthetic of, this level is made up of like giant dandelions. Right now, I'm fighting like flies and they're kicking my ass. I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, other than that, it doesn't do a whole lot that's like super unique to the Zelda series. I mean, it does some neat things, like you can learn new sword techniques, and there's this really weird kinstone system where you collect like little halves of coins, and you have to, and all the other people in the world have their own halves of coins, and if you find two halves that meet up, you can like get rewards and stuff. That was an odd system, which I mean, I never really felt like it belonged in the game, so to speak. But I mean, on the whole, I mean, I think Minish Cap is probably underappreciated because I mean, I guess it wasn't like a super stellar game, but for what it was really good. I mean, I really enjoyed playing through it. I played it through a couple times now, and it's just a really solid experience. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Honestly, it's probably my favorite handheld Zelda game. But with that said, next is Twilight Princess, which a lot like Minish Cap and Wind Waker. Well, maybe not Minish Cap, but a lot like Wind Waker and Majora's Mask. That's what I was thinking of. People like to kind of talk down on Twilight Princess. People like to bash it. And I'm not saying that it's, a perfect game, but I really don't get why people have so much hate for Twilight Princess, because I thought it was a really good game. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I mean, there are things wrong with it. I don't think it's, the penultimate Zelda experience. I mean, there are definitely things with the game that they did wrong and that they could improve on. But I enjoyed it. I mean, the graphic style, I mean, I'm a really big fan of the Wind Waker, but the graphic style in Twilight Princess was amazing. I really like it. And I mean, it really serves the game well. Because obviously it's a very dark game. I was really excited about playing a dark Zelda game. They didn't really do dark quite the way I would have preferred, because for the most part, their interpretation of dark was quite literally make everything black. And there's lots of darkness, more so than, I mean, there is a dark tone to the game, but not, I personally would have liked them to take the dark tone more, rather than just make everything really dark. Everything's really black. But I mean, the graphics were great. There were a lot of cool items in the game, which is kind of an interesting dilemma that Twilight Princess had, because more than probably any other Zelda game, Twilight Princess suffered a lot from having items that were like, here's this item, you get to use it 3 times, you use it to kill this dungeon's boss, and then you'll never use it ever again. And some of those items were pretty cool items. I was always a really big fan of the spinning top thing. I thought that was a really cool idea, and it's used, a decent amount throughout the game, but not as much as it could be. And I mean, I don't know, on the whole, Twilight Princess I thought was really good. One of the things that I especially liked was that it kind of took the combat of the series up a notch. The combat in that game felt really good. I mean, lots of fun, interesting techniques to use. They had mounted combat, which, I mean, has its issues, but I mean, it was an interesting idea, and it was executed fairly well. Of course, probably my biggest issues with Twilight Princess, one issue is, of course, the issue of, the final boss. I mean, there's a storyline issue to that, and there's also the fact that the final encounter is a little overdone. It's kind of hard to explain exactly without spoiling stuff. I realize the game is what? When did Twilight Princess come out? 2006? So it's 5 years old, but, I still don't like to do spoilers if I can avoid it. But, I mean, so that was an issue. It was almost like they're trying a little too hard to fit something in there that people didn't really want. The dark, not the darkness gameplay, but the whole, like, Link turns into a wolf thing, I thought that was a little bit forced, and I would have much preferred that they just find another way to add in, like, those functionalities that you have as a wolf, because turning into a wolf because you need to follow a scent, that was never very fun to me. I mean, just make it like a trail of magic that you can see with the Eye of Truth or whatever. Obviously, that's not an item that we had in Twilight Princess, but, whatever. The whole turning into a wolf thing, I guess it fit the theme of the game, but I never really liked it. And probably the number one issue that I had with Twilight Princess was exploration. It didn't have it. I mean, it did, but, like, I've always been of the opinion that the overworld of Twilight Princess is absolutely abysmal. Like, it's more or less a giant wide open field that, connects you from one spot to another. There's nothing interesting that goes on there. I mean, the secrets that you find there are terrible. Within the areas themselves, there isn't even a whole lot of exploration the same way that you would have in, like, Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time. And I felt like that was really missing. And I never really felt like it was worth my time to even try and explore Twilight Princess a whole lot, because it wasn't fun. It's like, I'm not exploring, I'm basically just covering every possible square inch of the game, looking for something to bomb or something. And it's like, they could have done it a lot better, in my opinion. And that was my biggest gripe with Twilight Princess. Aside from that, I thought it was a very solid game, and it did a lot of interesting things, a lot of fun items, nifty puzzles. The bosses were probably a little bit too, puzzly, instead of not enough combat to them. But on the whole, I don't think Twilight Princess deserves the reputation that it has. I think it was a very solid game. Now, after Twilight Princess, we have Phantom Hourglass. And, really, Phantom Hourglass is, in a lot of ways, very similar to Twilight Princess, in that it tends to get a little bit of a bad rap. But it's not entirely unwarranted. Or it's not entirely warranted, rather. Because, I mean, Phantom Hourglass, I thought, it was a good game. I mean, obviously, it's a little bit gimmicky. I mean, any game that is, entirely touch-controlled or uses the DS special features pretty much exclusively, as opposed to just being a game where, you control it with the D-pad like any other game. But any game like that is going to be gimmicky. But for the most part, I never felt like Phantom Hourglass went too over the top with that. There's a couple of exceptions. One is there's the whole thing where, yell really loud into the mic to get a discount. I thought that was completely moronic. And the other thing was, there was one part where you had to, like, close your DS to, like, make a copy of a map or something. I thought that was really dumb. It's like, how are you supposed to figure that out? Other than that, I thought that Phantom Hourglass made really good use of the DS's tools available. And I personally, I thought it was pretty neat being able to, like, draw on the map. And there's one island where you have to, like, literally draw the entire map yourself. The dungeons were a little simplistic starting off, but the last few dungeons were really good, I thought. The story, not the greatest. the whole concept of going back to the temple thing in the middle to explore it again every single time you finish a dungeon or whatever. That was a little annoying. I never really got too annoyed with it. Not as much as a lot of people seem to have, but I thought they could have done it better. They at least designed the temple well enough so that the next time you go back there, you have a new tool, so you can use that to open up a shortcut or something. So they at least designed the temple well. The biggest problem I had with it was, it's kind of interesting actually, because it was almost like a weird mixture between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess in this way, because as far as exploration, because it went back to the whole boat thing, which no one really liked in Wind Waker. But it's kind of interesting because Wind Waker, I always felt like the exploration was something that Wind Waker did really well. And yet this one has a boat, and it feels like Twilight Princess. It's like the world feels really empty. And for the most part, that's because the world was empty. It's like they didn't have enough space to fit stuff to explore into the world. So it just wasn't there. I have the same problem I have with that as I did with Twilight Princess. It's like, without that exploration being good and a key element, it's like, it feels like an empty experience. It doesn't feel like it's the full Zelda experience, because that's a big part of what makes a Zelda game. And of course, after Phantom Hourglass came Spirit Tracks. Well, technically there was Link's crossbow training in between, but we're not going to mention that. Much the same way we never mentioned the CDI games. That's not to say Link's crossbow training is bad, it's just not really a Zelda game so much. But anyway, Spirit Tracks is, I'm probably just going to gloss over it more or less, because it shares a lot with Phantom Hourglass, of course. I'm sure it uses the exact same engine. Well, maybe not the exact, it's probably modified. And I don't know, Spirit Tracks, I was really looking forward to it, but it kind of let me down. And truth be told, Spirit Tracks probably the least fun I've ever had playing a Zelda game. The dungeons were really dumbed down. They went really kind of casual with the dungeon. It's like, we don't want to make you think, because if we have to make you think, that's going to make people who aren't good at Zelda games not like it, or something stupid like that. So it took forever for the dungeons to ramp up. The last couple dungeons were pretty good. The game didn't feel big enough. It kind of suffered from the same thing as Phantom Hourglass. It's like they tried to squeeze too much into the DS, so they didn't have enough room to give it the kind of scale that a Zelda game needs. And probably my biggest gripes with Spirit Tracks is just the train stuff in general. They tried to make this, a big focus of the game, but I never felt like it really fit. Why would you want to make this a focus of your game? It's not fun. The only fun I ever had riding the train was the music. The fact that the music really fits well together with the chugging sound of your train, that was good. Listening to the music was entertaining, but that was the only part that was fun about the trains. Going from place to place wasn't fun. All of the little train puzzles where you had to go from this place to this place without getting caught by the bad trains, that was stupid. Pretty much all of those. They had some good concepts there. The whole, you can travel from this place to this place automated, but you also have stuff to shoot at and just stuff to do in general. That in that regard is better than Phantom Hourglass, because navigating the overworld in Phantom Hourglass was terrible. And having, set train tracks that you can travel on made the exploration feel it's a little bit more rigid, but that never really felt like a problem. It felt more like Phantom Hourglass. It always felt like I was looking around the world, but there's nothing here. But Spirit Tracks at least made it feel like the world was more populated, almost. It's like there's stuff here, and it's like they made a point of making the places that you can actually go to have stuff in them, which helped a little bit. It helped the exploration aspects of the game, but not by much. And now that I'm done with Spirit Tracks, it's time to finally talk about Skyward Sword. Now, obviously, Skyward Sword isn't out yet. I haven't played it. I mean, people have played demos and stuff of it, but the more that they release on Skyward Sword, the more excited I get about this game. I mean, I gotta say, it looks amazing. I mean, I don't want to get my hopes up too high because, I mean, getting your hopes up is never a good thing to do. But I mean, I can't help it. My hopes are so high for this game. I mean, everything from the graphic style to the gameplay to the story, to the music to some of the features that they've been hinting at recently just sounds just so good. Like it sounds like a game that I'm really going to be able to sink my teeth into and just play it and play it and play it and play it and play it. And there's going to be tons of stuff to do and places to explore and things to find and people to talk to, and the story is going to be interesting, I hope. I'm a little apprehensive about the gameplay because, of course, a big focus of Skyward Sword is supposed to be the whole motion control, like you control your sword directly or whatever. So obviously, no one really likes the waggling on the Wii, and that's going to be a big part of Skyward Sword. But using the Wii Motion Plus, hopefully it should at least be good. So I'm a little apprehensive, but kind of optimistic about that. So I guess I should kind of point out some of the stuff that they've recently revealed about this game. So first off, they said that it is going to have a second playthrough. I'm not quite sure if it's like a second playthrough or a New Game Plus or what, but it kind of reminds me of the second quest in the original Zelda game, and I think that's probably intended. They've kind of seemed all along like they've really taken a really close look at the previous Zelda games and kind of tried to pull the best aspects of them and make Skyward Sword the best all-around experience that we can have. And there's also going to be a challenge mode. I don't know if that's like just kind of like similar to the boss rush mode they had in Ocarina of Time 3DS, or if it's kind of a more fleshed out challenge mode thing. But that should be interesting. And they're saying, all told, it should be 50 to 100 hours of gameplay, which that sounds great. I mean, most Zelda games recently haven't touched that. And I probably the biggest thing I'm excited about with Skyward Sword is that it feels like it's going to be a Zelda game. A real Zelda game in every way. And I've sung the praises of every Zelda game so far, but at the same time, it's almost felt like, up until now, like we haven't had a real Zelda game since probably, I would say Wind Waker. A lot of people would probably say Ocarina of Time. And I mean, Ocarina of Time came out in 98. Wind Waker came out in 2002. So that's almost, that's 9 years for Wind Waker. I said 2002, right? Yeah, 9 years for Wind Waker, 13 for Ocarina of Time. That's a long time. I mean, Zelda games between then and now, there have been good ones. I like Twilight Princess. The handheld games were okay. But Skyward Sword looks like it's going to be a real Zelda experience. All the things that make Zelda games great, including the things that were missing in all the games in the last decade. And that makes me very excited.